Some leaders choose to hide behind walls, surrounded by security and high gates, but others walk among their people, feeling the heartbeat of the nation as it pulses around them. The morning sun in Wagadugu, the capital of Burkina Faso, spread its warm golden light across the dusty streets, creating an inviting and vibrant atmosphere. From the gates of the presidential palace, President Ibrahim Traoré emerged, not into the safety of an armored convoy, but onto the open road. His security, detail trailed behind, maintaining a respectful distance, allowing him the freedom he cherished. Traoré had always preferred walking through the streets of his country, feeling the raw, unfiltered pulse of its people. These walks weren't just a habit for him, they were essential. They allowed him to see his country in its true form, to hear its sounds, breathe its air, and feel its heart. The city was alive with the rhythm of West Africa. The cries of market vendors echoed, calling out their prices. Children dashed between the stalls, their laughter filling the air. Motorcycles hummed by, weaving through the traffic, their engines a constant hum of energy. The breeze carried the scent of grilled meat, mingling with the dry dust that clung to the streets. With each step, President Traoré moved like just another man in the crowd, a figure indistinguishable from the thousands of others hustling along the same streets. He wasn't a leader hiding behind tinted windows or high walls. He was part of the fabric of his nation. Then, as he turned a corner near the central market, something stopped him in his tracks. Beneath the patchy shade of a weathered baobab tree sat an elderly man, hunched on a bench fashioned from wooden crates. His clothes were faded and worn, the fabric barely holding together after many years of washing. Patches covered his clothes where time and wear had left their marks. But it wasn't poverty that stopped Traoré. It was recognition. He had seen this man before, many years ago, and the memory rushed back in a tidal wave. The way the elderly man held his head, the careful way he turned the pages of the worn book in his hands, it was unmistakable. The man on the bench was none other than Professor Ismael, the educator who had shaped Traoré's thinking in the days of his youth. Suddenly, President Traoré was no longer standing on a bustling street corner. He was back in a cramped classroom years ago, listening to his teacher's booming voice as it thundered with passion on the subjects of ethics, justice, and human dignity. He remembered the sound of chalk scraping across a blackboard, the feeling of being challenged by new ideas, and the old dog-eared books that the professor had purchased with his modest salary. Those evenings spent tutoring struggling students, imparting knowledge that would go on to change lives. Those memories flooded back to him. Professor Ismael had once said, "Knowledge is the only wealth no one can steal from you." And now, here, he was, sitting on the streets of Wagadugu, reading quietly while the chaos of the market swirled around him. Traoré felt a tightness in his chest, part sorrow, part anger. How could a nation let one of its brightest minds be left to fade into obscurity? How could a teacher, a man who had dedicated his life to educating others, be reduced to this? Traoré stepped forward quietly, careful not to startle the old man. Up close, he saw the book, philosophical essays, the same kind of book that had once challenged young minds in the classroom. Professor Ismael looked up, blinking, as if pulled from a distant memory. His eyes narrowed at first, cautious, but then they widened in recognition. "Ibrahim?" The voice was thin, uncertain. It took a moment for the man to remember, but once he did, his face broke into a smile, fragile but genuine. "Yes, it's me," Traoré replied. Ismael struggled to rise from the bench, his legs weak and unsteady. Traoré stepped forward, taking the old man's arm to steady him. Ismael's frail body felt light, almost too light, his bones sharp beneath the thin cloth of his sleeve. "It's been far too long, Professor," Traoré said softly, his voice filled with warmth. The old man smiled, his eyes glistening. And far too many things have changed. Except you. You still walk among the people. Don't call me president, Traoré replied firmly, but with kindness in his eyes. To me, you will always be my teacher. Ismael shook his head slowly, a sad smile curling his lips. Things have changed, Ibrahim. I am not the man you once knew in that classroom. You will always be the man who taught me the value of dignity, Traoré said, gripping his teacher's worn hands. But tell me, how did it come to this? Professor Ismael's gaze dropped to the dusty ground. The air between them grew heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Around them, the marketplace carried on, the noise of vendors shouting, goats bleating, and the scent of grilled food filling the air. But for the two men, the world had gone silent. Finally, Ismael spoke, his voice low. My house was taken when the debts grew too heavy. After 40 years of service, my pension doesn't even cover a month's food. He flexed his thin fingers, his hands trembling. Prices climb every day, but our pensions stay frozen as if we're relics nobody cares about. Professor Ismael hesitated. For a moment, looking at the hand that Traoré offered. The pride of a lifetime had always kept him standing on his own, never accepting help, but something about the sincerity in the president's eyes made him pause. He let out a small breath and took the offered hand, standing with more effort than he expected. Thank you, Ibrahim, he whispered, his voice full of emotion. The walk to the car felt like a journey between two worlds. The world of struggle and despair, and the world that still held a promise of dignity. As they approached the presidential vehicle, the world around them seemed to stand still. The dusty streets, the noise of the marketplace, and the sweat of survival seemed worlds apart from the polished elegance of the car waiting for them. For a moment, it felt as if Ismael was crossing into something unrecognizable. But the strength in Traoré's words had begun to reignite a sense of hope. Once inside the vehicle, the noise of the streets faded into the background, replaced by the hum of the engine and the cool air circulating through the cabin. Ismael sat quietly, still overwhelmed by the rapid change in his life. Where are we going, Ibrahim? Ismael asked quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. To the Burkina Development Bank, Traoré replied, his tone steady. We're starting a revolution, not with protests or weapons, but with dignity and real change. Ismael's mind raced. He couldn't understand fully what the president meant, but the unwavering conviction in his voice made something stir inside him. Maybe this wasn't just about him. Maybe this was about something much bigger, something that could affect thousands, if not millions of people who had been forgotten just like him. By the time they arrived at the Burkina Development Bank, word had already begun to spread. It was unusual for the president to visit a bank without prior notice. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Manager Musao Araugo, who had been quietly finishing paperwork, looked up in surprise as the president walked in, accompanied by the elderly man. His face quickly adjusted from the shock of seeing Traoré in person to the respectful composure of a professional. Mr. President, Araugo stammered, quickly standing from his desk. This is an unexpected honor. How can we assist you today? Traoré's voice rang clear and firm across the marble floors. Mr. Araugo, meet Professor Ismael Zongo, one of the greatest educators this country has ever known. He taught me philosophy and ethics. He inspired thousands of students over the years. For a moment, Ismael stood still, uncertain of how to react. He was a man who had lived for decades in the shadows, teaching with passion, struggling with dignity, and now, in a moment, he was being recognized as one of the most important men in the nation. He wasn't sure if he deserved it, but as the whispers of the employees spread, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he did. Professor Ismael has been living on the streets, Traoré continued, his voice carrying across the room. Because his pension can't even cover the basics. This is unacceptable, and it ends today. The room froze. It wasn't just the employees in the lobby who were stunned. Everyone in the building felt the weight of the words. The idea that a man who had spent decades building the country's future, educating its youth, could be reduced to such a state was almost too much to process. Araugo cleared his throat, trying to collect his thoughts. Of course, Mr. President. But what exactly do you want us to do? I want a special fund for retired educators and public servants, Traoré said, his words deliberate and unwavering. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, anyone who dedicated their life to building, this nation must never again face what Professor Ismael has endured. Araugo's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't a request. It was a demand. The magnitude of what Traoré was proposing was undeniable. The idea of such a fund would take significant coordination and funding, but the fire in the president's eyes left no room for hesitation. Mr. President, Araugo said carefully, such a program will need substantial capital and coordination with several ministries. Traoré interrupted him, his tone still calm but resolute. Then we start now. Set up an emergency fund today. I want aid reaching people within 48 hours. The paperwork can come later. What matters is that people like Professor Ismael cannot wait. Araugo began scribbling notes furiously, his mind already working through the logistics. The young secretary, in the background, subtly angled her phone, already recording the moment. Within moments, social media was alive with the story. Hashtags began trending, and the world started paying attention. Ismael, quiet until now, finally spoke. Ibrahim, I'm grateful, but I cannot accept help unless everyone in my position receives the same. Traoré smiled faintly, placing a hand on his teacher's shoulder. You taught me that leadership means fixing the system, not just saving one person. What starts here will help thousands. The minutes that followed were a blur of activity. Araugo returned with a plan for the Emergency Relief Fund. With government backing, we can launch the program immediately. Based on our records, roughly 3,000 retired teachers and 5,000 other public servants qualify. Traoré nodded firmly. Do it, and send me regular updates. This isn't for headlines. It's about changing how we value the people who built this country. By late afternoon, the movement had grown beyond the walls of the bank. The story had spread across news channels, social media, and television broadcasts. Retired public, servants across the country began sharing their own stories of struggle. A retired nurse, Aminata Khan, posted a video, tearfully explaining how she had trained generations of healthcare workers, but now struggled to afford her own medications. A former agricultural officer shared how, after decades of teaching farmers new techniques, he had lost his own land to unpaid taxes when his pension fell short. By evening, Burkina Faso values was trending worldwide. African leaders and development, experts praised Traoré's bold move as a model for tackling systemic inequality across the continent. The next morning, the transformation was palpable. Professor Ismael stood beside Traoré at a press conference, looking healthier, more vibrant. His voice, once frail, now rang with steady strength. Today, I have seen the values I taught my whole life, dignity, compassion, and social responsibility, turn into action, he said, his words echoing across the nation. President Traoré has shown that true leadership means seeing the human being behind the statistics. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, not just for Ismael, but for the idea that the country had chosen compassion over indifference.